Welcome to the Change Pod, where you come to learn about how change happens. My name is Marc Thompson from Oxford University.
And I'm Matthew Schulte from HEC Paris.
Are we on? Yeah, it's going.
Okay, you want to start?
Okay. Yeah, this whole issue of workarounds is really quite intriguing.
Well, you should say first that this issue is about the workarounds.
Okay, yeah. Welcome to the Change Pod, and today we're going to be talking about workarounds. And I guess workarounds are something that we use on a daily basis. I mean, I certainly use them. I cook a lot. I enjoy cooking. And when I'm in the kitchen, I have a recipe book. It's kind of like the rules of the system, isn't it? That's what you have to do in order to produce this perfect meal. But we all have those issues, don't we, when we're cooking, when the ingredient isn't there. You've been to the supermarket, or at least I've been recently, and the shelf is empty. Why is that? Well, I'm not going to mention Brexit. I shouldn't mention Brexit. But anyway.
Yeah, a very British example, I wanted to say. But yeah.
I know, but these things happen.
Wouldn't happen in France. Our markets are full.
But anyway, we work with these constraints now, and we have to have workarounds. So I'm quite often looking at the fridge or whatever else, and I'm substituting. I'm bringing in a different ingredient. Or I might use olive oil instead of butter, for example, if I'm doing some cooking.
Well, you always should use olive oil instead of butter, I think, no? It's healthier?
Well, sometimes they say it is, sometimes they say it isn't. I mean, this is the problem with scientific knowledge. It's changing all the time, isn't it? The context changes in which you're kind of using these substances. Anyway, so cooking, we're always using workarounds, or maybe the next best thing might be olive oil instead of butter, or palm oil instead of butter, or whatever it is. So yeah, I think cooking is a pretty good example of that.
I think at this point, our listeners are wondering why this turned into a cooking channel. It's not about change, but I think there's a larger point here, right? About workarounds and change, and also organizational change. Because organizations use workarounds all the time, and they have to, basically. Because we always think, when we think about change, as this planned, managed, controlled thing where we have this goal, we know what the vision should look like.
Just like cooking, it's a recipe. You've got a recipe, follow the recipe, follow all the steps.
You have the recipe, and it's about executing the perfect recipe. Exactly. But then, as we know, very often things are happening. Resources are constrained, unforeseen challenges. So you have to be creative, and you have to work around those obstacles that you encounter on the way. And it's in a way against our traditional management philosophy, which is all about rational, planned behavior. So it's seen as basically a bad execution of change. But in reality, things are happening. You have to deal with these issues.
Exactly. I remember that story that when we did the Positive Deviance Change Pod a while ago about the famine in Vietnam, and how there they discovered that certain villagers in the community were being quite creative in terms of how they created, I'm back to the cooking again, right? But anyway, they created meals for the family by substituting different ingredients, which were not acceptable in terms of the norms of the kind of community, because those ingredients were seen to be, they're not nice, they're kind of disgusting or whatever else, but they had nutritional value, and they kind of bulked out the dish, and they were able to use it in quite creative ways to stave off the famine. And this is what we're up against, aren't we, in a way, when you talk about what's acceptable and what's not. It's also about the norms, the rules, or how we kind of conceive of what's possible or what is acceptable or reliable when we do change. You have to stick within the system.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and since you mentioned system, right? I mean, this is also coming from the systems thinking approach, that systems are so complex and there's so many layers, you cannot plan everything ahead. I mean, you have to go with what's happening in the moment. More in academic terms, there's this notion of effectuation, right? That comes from Saraswati. It basically means this: don't think about what we ideally should be doing, but think about what you can do in a certain situation. What tools are available? What can I do to start the change? even if it's not elegant, even if it's not an efficient solution, very often they call it a clumsy solution, right? It's a clumsy solution to a problem, but a clumsy solution is better than no solution or no approach of tackling the problem at all.
Yeah, and you're sitting in France at the minute, and the French have a great term for this called bricolage, which basically in English means DIY. But bricolage, I think, is more helpful because it kind of brings across this idea of assembling kind of resources in different ways and so on. And that's really what we're talking about, being pragmatic, using what's at hand, and being inventive and creative to solve a problem at that point in time. We can't wait. We can't wait for the perfect arrangement of resources to arrive, or we have to act now. So I like that idea, and I think the workaround speaks to this notion of bricolage.
So maybe we should get to our guest today, Paulo Savaget. He just published a book on workarounds and created a topology of different kinds of workarounds, tons of examples, tons of stories that we will also discuss today. So I'm looking forward to the interview.
Yeah, and I think it's going to be really helpful to have a kind of lexicon or a language for us to think about workarounds in a way that can make it more tractable, to help us, frame these types of problems with a language or a set of ways of thinking about it. So I'm looking forward to this one. Today, we're really happy to have one of my colleagues, actually, Paulo Savaget, as our interviewee. Paulo's just published a really fascinating book called The Four Workarounds, based on research he's been doing over many years. And today, we really want to explore how this book came about and explore in more depth some of the stories that the book is actually full of to really illustrate these workarounds. So without further ado, it'd be great to understand, Paulo, a bit more about how you came to this idea of workarounds and what you mean by them.
Thank you, Marc, and thank you, Mattis, for inviting me as well. I came up with the idea of workarounds. It was pure serendipity. I wasn't searching for workarounds. I had worked for quite a few years as a consultant on very different projects in the middle of the Amazon with traditional populations, but also high-end offices in large cities. And as I worked with many different target audiences, consulting on sustainability and innovation management, systems change, I came up with relatively similar recommendations, like more coordination, more alignment, more collaboration, things that are not necessarily wrong, but I thought that they were very generic and they made me a bit frustrated. So I started thinking, who doesn't necessarily rely on these recommendations? So what are the other ways of acting in complex systems? And then I thought of computer hackers because they make change so quickly, so resourcefully. Within a matter of hours, they break into systems and make change. And I didn't know much about hacking when I started, but I was interested in how they approached complex systems. And my assumption at the time was that perhaps we could address sustainability problems in a very hacky way as well. Can we hack education? Can we hack healthcare? Can we borrow this approach from computer hackers to address other sorts of problems? Then, as I worked with computer hackers, I realized a few things. One was that the core of the hacker approach is that they work around. They don't try to confront obstacles, but they find ingenious ways of working around them. One of the analogies that I often use is that one of the most notorious computer hacks is called Trojan horse. And it indicates that you don't necessarily have to break into the walls of a city to find a way in. You may find very unconventional and ingenious ways. But in reality, working with computer hackers, I realized, I learned from them that they already referred to many organizations and individuals that worked in completely different systems that were not computational. So let's say in healthcare, in education, addressing problems like climate change, they already refer to them as hackers, even though perhaps these individuals, these organizations didn't describe themselves as such. Computer hackers describe them as hacky. They were hacking financial systems, for example, or they were hacking education systems. Then I pivoted my research to study these organizations that were hacky in the ways that they approached complex problems in systems that were not necessarily computational. And then I studied these many different ways of working around complex obstacles to get immediate results.
It might be helpful to just kind of clarify how you see those different workarounds and how you would differentiate them.
I worked with many cases of workarounds, and I identified that they all followed or they fit these four approaches. Roughly speaking, one emphasizes different relationships or different systems. One is focused on resources. One is focused on behaviors. And the other one is on roles. The first one I call piggyback, and it's about finding different pairings or different relationships that were unconventional and unexplored. A case that I worked very closely with in Zambia is an organization that realized that you don't find life-saving medicines like for diarrhea treatment, that is one of the biggest killer of children under the age of 5 in the country, in remote regions. This medicine is not found, even though it's affordable. Even populations living in extreme poverty could purchase the medicine because it's so cheap. It doesn't have intellectual property rights. There's no overdosage. It doesn't require refrigeration, but still it cannot be found. And the obstacles include, for example, lack of infrastructure or very poor infrastructure, public facilities, for example, but roads as well for transportation of the medicine. And most organizations trying to address the problem will confront the obstacles. They're going to try to improve infrastructure. They're going to try to build hospitals. These things that are, of course, critical, but they take a long time frame. And there are many chances that they will fail as well, or at least some of these efforts will fail. And if you are a small organization, you feel completely disenfranchised because you are not going to have the resources to build roads or to build public facilities, right? So this very small organization of only 2 people realize that you don't find these medicines in remote regions, but you find things like Coca Cola everywhere. And then they started literally piggybacking on Coca Cola's distribution chain. In the beginning, feeding medicines between bottles in a Coca Cola crate to take a free ride to remote regions. And then they started emulating, pretty much like using the same distribution and value chain of Coca Cola and other fast moving consumer goods to expand that to many districts in Zambia. And the uptake of the medicine in a matter of a few years, like 5 to 7 years, increased from less than 1% to more than 50%, which is an outstanding result for such a cheap intervention. And what it teaches us is that you don't have to necessarily address a problem in healthcare by thinking only through the frames of healthcare. You can piggyback on what already exists from another system. You can leverage the success from fast moving consumer goods to address a problem in healthcare. And there are many possible pairings and relationships that you can find because there's so much unexplored potential across silos. And workarounds allow you to do that in very effective ways.
This piggybacking one is interesting because the infrastructure is already there. It's repurposing the infrastructure in a sense.
It's exactly what you said, Marc. I think that when we think of approaching problems, and especially in situations of complexity, we start from a problem, right? And then we try to understand the problem in its fullness. So let's say if you're gonna think of lack of access to medicines, you're going to try to understand all the obstacles that prevent the medicines from being found. And the conventional approach is to tackle these obstacles that are perceived as constraining or being the root causes of these problems. What I try to show with this book is that we don't necessarily have to start from what lacks. We can start from what already exists, the potentialities. And that's the essence of the piggyback. You don't have to start from, oh, there's poor infrastructure or there's poor logistics. Okay, true. But there's already stuff happening there. There are already many successes. might be unconventional. There might be other systems in place that work well. Can you leverage them? And that's, I think, one of the core insights from this workaround. There's so much missed value across silos or relationships that have not been fully explored. We get numb to different ways of bearing them because we focus too much on confronting the obstacles in front of us.
Paulo, besides the piggybacking, you describe another approach of workarounds in your book, which you called the roundabouts. Those are new ways of changing people's behaviors. And one example in your book of roundabouts stuck with me because it was so simple and yet so powerful in changing people's behavior. And I'm talking obviously about the Indian case of public urination. Can you tell the story to our listeners?
Of course, yes. That's one of the most everyday trivial cases, and it's the only one, and one that I like a lot because it's the only one whose authorship I don't know, because it became so commonplace afterwards because it works so well. It's a case that I found out when walking in a big city in India. I was walking in Delhi, but I also noticed in other big cities in India the same pattern. It's very common for men to urinate in public spaces in urban cities in India. When you talk to people like why and ask why is this so commonplace, they would say, oh, it's inevitable. Men have done this for centuries. They're not going to stop. And it's very gendered. I'm using the word men on purpose because women, it's not only a lack of public toilets, because women normally find places to relieve themselves that are not in public spaces in urban cities. And men still urinate on walls very openly and very commonly in the city center and so on. When walking in India, you clearly see a lot of men urinating on walls, for example. But I saw some walls that were clean. And the reason why these walls were clean is that these owners of the walls put tiles of Hindu gods on these walls. Because, and then you realize that the hack there is that people will not urinate on a god. That's heresy, that's blasphemy. So wall owners found creative workarounds to, so to speak, that divert the stream elsewhere, right? People will cross the street or go somewhere else to urinate, but they're not going to urinate on their walls. That's a workaround that became so common that it's now used in many other cities, many other settings as well. Even in kitchens, for example, I saw that people use that to remind cooks to wash their hands and so on. They have tiles of Hindu gods.
What a great example of a workaround, right? and then you describe a third group of workarounds that are probably the most familiar to us, and those are the loopholes. Loopholes in the sense of getting around rules without breaking them, like the tax loopholes that we know corporations are so fond of. And I have to say, this was probably the most controversial chapter for me, because the central thread of your book is how workarounds help people who are disempowered to beat the system. So you gave this great example of a Brazilian cleaning lady who found a legal loophole to not pay back the horrendous interest on her credit card debts that she only got because she paid the medical bills of her husband. I think most of us can get behind this kind of a workaround. But then I was thinking, I mean, all workarounds, and especially loopholes, cannot just be used for good, but also for bad, if not evil reasons, right? So, I mean, can we really advertise workarounds in general, or doesn't it depend on who uses them for what reason? I mean, ultimately, they're a means to an end, right? So, doesn't it depend on the end then whether we should get enthusiastic about them?
Exactly. I see workarounds as a problem-solving approach that is not inherently positive or negative. It depends on the context, but it also depends on people's interpretation. I, on purpose, included many cases in the book that were controversial. And the loophole ones are the most controversial because you are clearly working around rules, right? And that can be pretty controversial. That case, for example, of a cleaning lady that got herself in debt after paying for medicines for her husband that was sick, and then she was charged an exorbitant interest rate from the bank. That, for me, that's a legitimized exploitation of the poor, right? Like that's how I would see that. A bank charging 20% per month interest rate on a debt is absurd in any ways. But a lot of people will disagree. They will think that that's normal, that's the rule, it's legal, right? So, but what is interesting is that there are many legal ways of defying the status quo. And the one that she found was to work around by transferring her assets to a family member and waiting until the debt expired because they couldn't confiscate any of her assets because she had none, right? And then the debt kept increasing, but they couldn't get any of her assets. So that's the workaround. But there are other workarounds as well that I mentioned that are very controversial. I have a case on abortion rights that is an extremely sensitive topic, right? In the book, I position myself, I say, I understand that this can be controversial, different views, depending on religious views and also your morals, your values. I personally think that women should be allowed to get an abortion service on demand. I understand that it's not necessarily the only view. That specific workaround is a group that I studied from the Netherlands that take women who reside in countries where abortion is illegal. So let's say they go to Poland on board a boat from the Netherlands. And then when they reach Poland or any other country where abortion is illegal, women who want an abortion service, they can go on board and they sail to international waters. It's not far from the coastline, right? It's very doable from an operational perspective. And then in international waters, the legislation that applies is the one of the flag of the boat. And because the boat is Dutch, it's the Dutch legislation that applies. So then they can provide these women legal abortion services and safe as well, because it's with safe methods and with the support from doctors and nurses, and then take them back to the countries where they reside. In that way, they're not violating the legislation, they are working around them. Again, very controversial. It depends on people's morals, right? I also show cases that I disagree with. As you said, tax avoidance from the top 1% richest people in the world is not something that I appreciate, but it's a loophole that has been used very often. Or, for example, high income countries sending electronic waste that is very contaminant to places like Ghana, but it's not legal. There's a to just send waste, electronic waste, because it's contaminant. It goes against the Basel Convention. But the workaround that they use is that they sell secondhand products instead of saying that they are sending discarded products. And that way they work around this rule of not crossing borders with contaminant waste. Some people may disagree with me and think that this is okay, right? But I personally disagree. And that's one of the reasons why in the book I describe workarounds as a problem solving approach, but I also describe the morality of workarounds and what it means to be a deviant and the implications that it has on your identity, your value systems, and so on and so forth.
We're in a kind of perma crisis, multiple crisis, climate change, the kind of problems that we're now encountering. I mean, this is why this book is so interesting, is it may put many more people in a position where they feel morally obliged to hack systems because it's for the greater good, because those systems are no longer serving us well or need to be repurposed. But it goes back to Matisse's point, which is really about the issue of power, isn't it? How do you get power to act, really? I mean, and power can come from values and a sense of morality, which can be an individual driver. Power also comes from a sense of connectivity with others, doesn't it? And can you feel like you have power because you're part of a collective and so on, to begin to scale, to begin to act and change systems. I'm just wondering, if we think about heavily institutionalized environments we're in, where people are just kind of blindly going through the day and accept all the rules and all the rest of it, how do we begin to scale up this kind of more oppositional or subversive or deviant characteristics? Is it a power issue? You know, is it about giving people more power in the organization to be subversive? Or do we just say, actually, it's just part of human nature, and hopefully those subversive people will just pop up and we'll be okay?
Every time we think of a problem, whichever problem you can think of, there's normally an assumption of who's meant to be addressing that problem, right? Like if you think of racial inequality, most people would say the government and the judicial system should be enforcing rules, norms, law enforcement, or changing laws, right? Most people would say that. Or if you think of innovation processes, you're probably going to think of large companies or startups, right? So there's always an assumption of actors that should be accountable for problems. Problem with that is that it disenfranchises many others from acting. And workarounds are very empowering because they are accessible ways of challenging that as well. Like most cases I have in the book are from organizations that were not the ones that would be seen as meant to be addressing the problems. Workarounds challenge not only how problems are meant to be addressed, but also who is meant to be addressing those problems. And it's very empowering because it's something that individuals can do, small organizations can do, small nonprofits, but also even large companies, when they are not necessarily the ones accountable for those problems, they might be working around as well. So it is a power issue. There's definitely a power angle to this discussion. And on your question on scaling, what I think is fascinating as well is that we constantly pursue workarounds. Most people who haven't thought of workarounds, haven't read the book, probably worked around as well. And one of the feedbacks I often get when talking to people that read my book is that they say, I didn't have a word for this, but I have this case. And then they tell me a case, or they tell something they have done a few days ago that was a workaround. But with the book, what I tried to do was exactly to give toolkits so that people can do that more systematically. They can pursue that in many complex situations they face. And also to show that workarounds are not only patches to get things done. Workarounds can be extremely transformative of situations we find ourselves. And many cases that I show in the book, like, for example, when Ruth Bader Ginsburg worked around to defend the case of a man who was discriminated for his sex, when in reality she was very interested in cases that women had been discriminated for their sex. She realized that defending a case of a man who, if he were a woman, he would have been entitled to a tax deduction because he was single and cared for his elderly mother. The law at the time didn't conceive a man having carrying responsibilities, right? That was a clear discrimination of his sex. And when she took that case, she knew that it would be much easier to prove discrimination in front of all male judges in a case that a man had been discriminated, when she constantly struggled to show that women were also discriminated, right? She had experience with other cases that challenge because judges would just think that women were not discriminated. They were getting the best of two worlds, or they were so fragile that they had to be taken care of. When she took that case, it was a very small case of a man who was discriminated for his sex, and won that case along with others. She created a precedent that was later used by many, including herself, but many other lawyers, by Congress people, by Supreme Court justice, to show and to topple down a system of sex-based discrimination in the US, because that was applicable to many other circumstances as a precedent. That's one of the cases that very clearly show how, perhaps intentionally, a workaround can be a starting point for very transformative change. But I also have other cases that show that a workaround to address a very immediate problem here and now, with the resources you have available, you're trying something rough, a patch to address a problem for a few people, that can also scale in very unexpected ways. I have cases, for example, that show legislations being changed after that were triggered by a workaround, or cases, for example, of some of the most innovative products we have that were created through workarounds as well, and that people didn't necessarily know from the outset what they were embarking on. So workarounds is empowering in the sense that it challenges conventions on who's meant to be addressing problems, but it's also empowering in terms of magnitude of the impact you have, because you don't necessarily have to start from the assumption that you're going to go full on and aim for big change. You can start small, and that may open many possibilities in the future for scaling, for expanding your impact.
Let me try to challenge this notion of scaling small workarounds to change systems. Because I could also imagine that workarounds, especially those practical patches, stabilize a flawed system instead of changing it. To give you a simple example, so my son at one point had not a great math teacher, to put it mildly. And parents were concerned that their kids did not learn anything and would struggle in their final exam. So we found this workaround patch, which you would call the best next thing workaround, by hiring a tutor collectively to run small group math sessions. And this way, the cost of the tutor were lower per kid, and yet the kids could learn what they did not learn in class. So in fact, they did better in the final exam than the years before. I mean, you could say this is a nice practical workaround, and it is. At the same time, you could say, well, it's fixing a symptom without addressing the root cause. I mean, the bad teacher was still there. Perhaps the teacher should have been fired, or perhaps he was so underpaid in a broken educational system that he wouldn't be able to perform well anyway. But by finding this patch by the parents, the system or the root cause of the problem remained unchallenged, no?
It can be patches that address problems immediately, like the case of a tutor, for example. It addressed a problem in an immediate way. Perhaps if you had tried to ask for teacher to be fired or improve the conditions for the teacher to become a better teacher, it would have taken a lot of time that your son or didn't have, right? So it may be a patch, but it can also open many new opportunities that you didn't know from the outset. Perhaps this is actually providing better education to this student because now they have the teacher that is not excellent and also support outside the school, right? So it depends a bit on your interpretation as well. What I normally say, though, is that, well, first, there's a dark side to workarounds, that workarounds can become institutionalized and might prevent us from approaching problems in more structured ways. So that happens. And I get that a lot from people who, like myself, come from the global south and constantly say, yeah, workarounds, great, we get things done. But sometimes they become the default way of getting things done, and that might be an issue, right? So I do agree with that. Yeah, I think that happens very often.
It's funny that you hear this argument more from people of the global south, because I'm from Germany, which probably has the opposite of a Brazilian workaround mindset. I don't think that Germans are well known for outplaying the system. You know, the joke that a German would rather stop in front of a red light in the middle of nowhere at 3 a.m. in the morning and wait for 10 minutes until the light turns green rather than running the red light. But then I guess the underlying belief here is that a flawed system is better than no system. So traffic might not be a bad example, actually. If everyone would found workarounds to get faster from A to B, you know, outsmarting speed limits and police radar and so on, we would probably have more accidents and casualties. So it seems that sometimes too much of a workaround mindset could be problematic, no?
Exactly. And as any other problem-solving approach, it may have negative impacts as well, and especially if it's used extensively or in a way that is socially undesirable. But what I would emphasize is that we sometimes think that problems can be, and especially complex problems, can be solved, and they're just waiting for us to mobilize, coordinate ourselves, and go there and solve the problem. That's not the reality, right? Our reality is much more complex than that. We constantly face problems, and the nature of the problems we face also change over time. It's not only the solutions that change, the problems change. The parameters we use to understand and analyze these problems change. Until the 50s, we didn't know much about climate change, and now it's one of the biggest problems in the world. Or 200 years ago, what we interpreted as poverty is very different from what we interpret as poverty today. Even when I started studying, when I did my undergrad, the parameter for extreme poverty is different from the parameter now, right? In terms of how much money per day people get. So these problems are constantly changing. And if we take a static view of problem solving as if the problems were targets that were there to be addressed, we end up missing core insights from complexity studies that these things are constantly changing and we have to adapt. We have to find adaptive ways of approaching and addressing them.
I mean, I come from a kind of sociology of work background, and if you're in an organization and you want it to grind to a halt, what you do is you work to rule, because the rules were probably developed 10 years ago. And actually, the organizing practices, the work practices have moved on since then, because people have actually been using hacks and workarounds to be able to innovate, to do the job better all the time. So there's always these incremental changes going on all the time. So the kind of visible organization in terms of how the rules are kind of shaped and so on were generated at one point in time. But if you want to frustrate the organization, you just go say, well, we'll work to rule then. And nothing happens anymore, or things really, really slow down. Things are dynamically changing all the time, and we as humans are always adapting and changing and trying to make things work, because actually how we set out to design them was never perfect in the first place. So I guess my point is your mindset issue becomes really, really important here about how people view organizations or organizing or the phenomenon around them, because if they see it as static and it's fixed, it kind of disempowers them, doesn't it? But if they see it as kind of continually evolving and changing, and that's the way of the world, it opens up more potential for intervening and changing and acting in new ways.
This change in mindset is very empowering and very rich, right? Because so many opportunities arise from this. Once you stop thinking of problems are there to be solved, you only need to develop this rational thinking, effective method, efficient, that has a stepwise process to reach your goal. Once we break free from these management tenets that I think the three of us, disagree with, and start understanding reality through the lenses of dynamism, of adaptation, of pragmatism, we see potential for many approaches, many changes. And especially when working in complex situations, we normally say multifaceted problems, right? Workarounds allow you to approach a multifaceted problem from different facets of the problem. And that's very enriching. It doesn't mean that there's only one way forward. There are multiple viable possibilities to address a problem, and a problem that is changing. It's a moving target. That makes, for us as academics, something extremely rich analytically, because there's so much potential. There's so much that can be done. And for innovators, for problem solvers worldwide, likewise, so many possible approaches. Even when you feel constrained, paralyzed, if you search for a workaround, it might open many different possibilities in that context.
That was another bit of the book that really spoke to me as well, because we're interested in change. It's the change pod. How do things change? And you placed a lot of emphasis on acting. So doing something and then learning, rather than spending a lot of time thinking about the perfect solution or the perfect system. You need to experiment, you need to try something and kind of build from there, which is quite liberating in a way, because it kind of reduces the anxiety a bit, but that you have to do everything.
Yeah, I mean, even with big change challenges like climate change and digitalization, I mean, we hear a lot that we need more regulations and tighter systems. Elon Musk and Bill Gates and others call for regulations around artificial intelligence right now. And it's probably true, but at the same time, we cannot create a perfect system around these complex problems that would manage and control the change. I think the workaround mindset is a way of keeping systems flexible and adaptable, especially with these complex problems.
Exactly. Yeah. An approach that tries to organize, make things tidy in a complex situation will likely fail. And likewise, an approach that is too complicated in a complex situation will also probably fail. Workarounds bring that simplicity in a way that embraces complexity. It doesn't try to tame complexity. It embraces that complexity and tries to offer simple ways of intervening that may open many possibilities that you didn't even know they existed from the beginning. They are accessible and they might be seen as starting points as well for bigger transformation journeys.
Paulo, thank you so much for the interview. We really enjoyed talking to you.
Thank you very much. This was a great conversation. I enjoyed it a lot.
So Matthias, that was there was a lot of stories in there, weren't there? Lots of examples of these four workarounds. But I mean, what do you think some of the implications are of this model or this approach that Paulo was talking about?
Yeah, first of all, it's so engaging to listen to these stories. We love these stories. Very often, it's the narrative of the little guy who's beating the more powerful system in creative and clever ways. That has an appeal. That's already very inspiring, very motivating, and really encourages people to think about the workarounds that might be available in their area and the workarounds that help them to change and change the system. So I think that's really the power of these stories and the many examples that Paulo actually gave.
Yeah, and I think people really connect to story as a mode of change, particularly when they can see themselves potentially in there. And I think you're right, this kind of the little guy, Samson and Goliath sort of storyline is very powerful, but also empowering.
But as we discussed, I mean, we have to put it in perspective, as Paulo said. It's a means to an end. It's a tool that can be used for good or for evil or bad, right? So it's not always the narrative that the little guy is using these workarounds to get back or change the more powerful system. But sometimes the powerful system, aka tax loopholes, right, is using these workarounds for its advantage.
I mean, that's a perfect example because then that raises ethical implications, and then who benefits and who loses from these workarounds. And if we think of the tax system, I mean, the number of offshore tax loopholes that we have these days that are draining many countries of the ability to kind of invest in health systems, for example, for pandemic readiness. We've seen that across certain areas where the consequences of that are quite deep. So, yeah, what's good and what's bad? He's not trying to be normative and say that because these things, he's trying to be value neutral, saying a loophole is a loophole, but they can be good and they can be bad.
But speaking of tax loopholes, I think there's also more room for a dynamic perspective because the system, in a way, is responding to these workarounds, right? So ideally the system changes because of the workarounds. But as we discussed, the system can also be sustained. A flawed system can be sustained by the workarounds that make the system work. But there are also probably more dynamic perspectives of the system fighting back or becomes defensive or trying to fight the workarounds, right? And I mean, tax loopholes is a good example. So, I mean, one implication of people paying no taxes, that the tax rate goes up and then people are even more encouraged to find new loopholes to reduce the tax. So it creates this vicious circle of workarounds and the system responding to each other.
Absolutely. And looking at it from the other end, if we think about organizations and this notion of resistance to change, a lot of managers talk about resistance to change.
Big topic in change,
big topic.
right?
Why are people resisting change? How can I stop people resisting change? And I think Paulo's stories and a narrative give us some insight here, because maybe they're not resisting change. Maybe they're trying to adapt to it, and maybe they're creating workarounds to try and work with a very centralized, top-down, linear kind of model of change, and trying to bend the rules to make it work in their context.
Mm-hmm.
So it doesn't fit kind of what the designers think the change should be, but maybe they're being quite pragmatic and trying to make it work. Could be one interpretation.
That's a good point. So they're not fighting the change, they're fighting the way some designers think the change should be implemented.
Yeah, which has implications, again, for this issue of power and empowerment. The other theme I think what came through here was about framing.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So how do we frame change, and how do we make it broad enough to encompass some of these, what we might call deviations or micro innovations or whatever else? Or do we try and flatten everything out and say, okay, we don't like that because it doesn't kind of fit with our model? Or should we actually be more embracing of that and say, oh, that's interesting. How can we bring that in and work with it in that context to kind of make things
Mm-hmm.
work more effectively or more helpfully? So, yeah, there is something about the framing of the problem and then the framing of the solution and the change agent themselves and how they think about it and their mindset and so on, which kind of begins to emerge when you get deeper into this topic.
So let's think about that, because you're already starting to think about the implications here on organizational change, right? And organizational change leadership. And I think you're absolutely right. One is about how do we frame the change? Is it just like, as we said in the beginning, executing that grand plan that everyone has to adapt? Or do you create the sense of, okay, let's make it work. Let's find sometimes creative solutions. Let's look at how we use resources in a different way to make it work. Because we don't know what we encounter up front. We don't know what resources we might have or lack in the process of change. So let's take a practical perspective and see what we can do with what we have.
Yeah, I mean, the military are interesting here, aren't they? Because going into battle, they always say that the plans fall apart at the first contact with the enemy, and you have to improvise and start to rethink your strategies for going forward if you've lost X, Y, Z resources. And I think that's probably pretty similar to lots of change, linear top-down change process where, things don't work. So do you escalate your commitment to try and make it work, or do you sort of say, oh, let's reframe this? Let's think about what are the resources available to help with this issue and can address it. Mm-hmm. And I think Paulo also talked about something else which is really helpful here, which is about the potentiality of resources. Do we fully understand the potential of the resources that we've got? Mm-hmm. And I think his workarounds really talk to this notion of expanding the potentiality of a resource and how it might be utilized in some way. We don't use resources as widely as we could do. And I think one of the insights from Paulo is this potentiality. How can we actually rethink and expand how we think about resources?
Mm-hmm. Exactly. And it's fun in a way, right? It's creative. Back to the first point, right? It makes those stories so interesting because we like if people find creative ways to get things done. We like if people use things in a way that we haven't thought about before. And it's actually very inspiring.
That's unless it threatens your identity and threatens your power and threatens your sense of.
Yeah, then it's a different story.
Then it's a different, and that's what happens. That's what happens in organizations, isn't it? Someone comes up with a smart idea, but if it's from the wrong person in the wrong context, do they listen?
But I guess it also depends on certain occupations that already have that workaround mindset built in, for good or for bad, right? Think about lawyers. I mean, it's all about the workaround, how to interpret the rules, how to get around rules,
Where's the gap,
Where's the gap, right? So...
How can I use some law from 1647 in this context? precedent.
Exactly.
It hasn't been applied, but it's on the statute books. So lawyers are great at that.
I think we don't have a good ending sentence, so we have to find a workaround to end this. Any workaround that comes to your mind, Marc, to end this?
I think a technical problem is a very good one to end anything. Like
oh yeah,
the internet.
Sorry,
goes down,
I'm in a tunnel. My connection, Marc. I'm losing you. Take care. Bye.
Bye.